How does a 24-year-old aristocrat become the most cold-blooded assassin of the French Revolution? No screaming, no hesitation. She calmly walked into a tyrant's bathroom, drove a 5-inch kitchen knife straight through his chest, and quietly stood there, waiting for the police. Charlotte Corday's strike changed revolutionary France forever. Her transformation from a quiet provincial girl into the catalyst for the darkest chapter of modern Western history was not the result of some romantic mythology. Instead, it was driven entirely by the cold, calculated mechanics of radicalization. Charlotte was born in 1768 in Normandy into the petite noblesse. Her family had a title, but they had no money. They were poor aristocrats, a dangerous and isolating demographic in late 18th century France. More importantly, she was the great-granddaughter of Pierre Corneille, the legendary French playwright. Corneille's plays were not light entertainment. They were heavy psychological dramas about duty, the state, and the agonizing choices individuals must make for the greater good. His characters frequently sacrificed their personal happiness, and often their lives, for a higher political ideal. This was the intellectual bedrock of Charlotte's childhood. She was raised on a diet of classical stoicism and Roman virtue. When her mother died, her father could not afford to keep her. Charlotte was sent to the Abbaye aux Dames, a convent in Caen. But this was not a place of mindless religious indoctrination. In the years leading up to the Revolution, French convents were often repositories of radical thought. In the convent's library, Charlotte discovered the Enlightenment. She read Plutarch's Lives, obsessing over the ancient Greeks and Romans who overthrew tyrants. She absorbed the works of Rousseau and Voltaire. She did not read these texts as abstract philosophy. To a quiet, isolated, highly intelligent girl, these books were literal instruction manuals on how society should function. She built a perfect, unyielding moral framework in her mind. She became a Republican before the French Republic even existed. She believed in liberty, the rule of law, and the inherent dignity of the citizen. When the revolution broke out in 1789, she was thrilled. From the quiet safety of Caen, she watched the absolute monarchy crumble. She believed the utopian world she had read about in Rousseau was finally materializing. But revolutions do not follow the neat logical arcs of philosophy books. They are messy, brutal, and entirely unpredictable. By 1792, the initial moderate phase of the revolution had collapsed. The moderate faction, the Girondins, whom Charlotte deeply admired because they represented the educated, law-abiding, liberal ideals of the Enlightenment, were losing ground. Power in Paris was shifting to the streets, controlled by the radical Jacobins. And the Jacobins were heavily influenced by one man, Jean-Paul Marat. Marat was the antithesis of everything Charlotte believed in. He was a failed physician and scientist who had found his true calling as a professional agitator. He published a newspaper called L'Ami du Peuple, the Friend of the People. It was an incredibly popular, viciously paranoid publication. Marat did not argue policy. He argued treason. He saw counter-revolutionary plots in every shadow. When bread prices rose, he blamed aristocratic conspiracies. When the war against Austria went poorly, he blamed internal traitors. And his solution was always the same: execution. Marat used his newspaper to call for heads, first a few hundred, then thousands, then 100,000. He normalized the idea that political disagreements should be solved with a guillotine. The turning point for Charlotte, the moment the abstract political debate became a visceral, intolerable reality, was the September massacres of 1792. Panicked by rumors of foreign invasion and internal sabotage, Parisian mobs, encouraged by Marat's rhetoric, stormed the city's prisons. Over the course of a few days, they butchered over 1,000 inmates. Priests, political prisoners, and ordinary criminals were dragged into the courtyards and hacked to pieces with axes and swords. For Charlotte, observing from afar, this was the death of the Enlightenment. The revolution had been hijacked by a bloodthirsty mob, and she identified Marat as the central nervous system of that mob. Her resolve hardened in the summer of 1793. The Jacobins successfully purged the Girondins from the National Convention in Paris. Many of the surviving Girondin politicians fled to Caen, hoping to raise a federalist army to march on Paris and restore order. Charlotte attended their meetings. She listened to their speeches. She heard firsthand accounts of the terror Marat was unleashing. But Charlotte did not join their army. She looked at the situation with the cold, isolated logic of a Corday tragic hero. Armies meant civil war. Civil war meant thousands of innocent deaths. The problem, as she saw it, was not the people of Paris. The problem was the man manipulating them. Cut off the head of the snake, and the body will die. She made her decision entirely alone. She told no one, not her family, not the Girondin leaders. On July 9th, 1793, she packed a small bag, told her aunt she was fleeing to England to escape the coming violence, and boarded a carriage for Paris. She was 24 years old, and she was going to war. She arrived in Paris on July 11th. The city was a powder keg. Paranoia was the official currency. Charlotte checked into the Hôtel de la Providence. Her original plan was highly theatrical. She wanted to assassinate Marat on the floor of the National Convention, in front of all his political allies. She wanted it to be a massive public spectacle. She expected to be torn apart by the mob immediately afterward. That was the point. Her death was meant to be the final shocking argument that would wake the French people from their radical hypnosis. But the plan hit a geographic hurdle. Marat was no longer attending the convention. Marat was dying. He suffered from an excruciating, disfiguring skin condition. To find any relief from the burning and itching, he spent nearly all of his time sitting in a specially constructed, shoe-shaped copper bathtub in his apartment at 30 Rue des Cordeliers. He soaked in cold water mixed with minerals and vinegar. Across the tub lay a wooden board, which served as his desk. From this miserable, claustrophobic position, he continued to write L'Ami du Peuple, compiling new lists of traitors to be sent to the guillotine. This detail is critical. It meant Charlotte could not kill him in public. She had to enter his private sanctuary. She had to breach the inner circle of the most guarded, paranoid faction in France. On the morning of Saturday, July 13th, she left her hotel and walked to the Palais Royal. It was a bustling commercial center. She found a cutler's shop and purchased the 5-inch kitchen knife. She slipped it under her dress. She then went to Marat's apartment. The residence was fiercely guarded by his common-law wife, Simone Evrard, and a dedicated staff. They were accustomed to turning away angry citizens and potential assassins. When Charlotte arrived mid-morning, Simone barred the door. Charlotte was turned away. She did not panic. She returned to her hotel and deployed a psychological tactic. She wrote Marat a letter. She didn't appeal to his mercy. She appealed to his paranoia. She wrote that she had just arrived from Caen and possessed vital intelligence about the Girondin plotters gathering there. She knew Marat was desperate for names to fill his execution lists. She offered him exactly what he wanted. She returned to the apartment in the early afternoon. Again, she was denied entry. Marat had not yet seen the note. She went back to the hotel and wrote a second, more desperate letter. She played the victim. She claimed she was being persecuted for her Republican beliefs and begged for his protection. She was weaponizing her gender and her social standing. A young, seemingly vulnerable woman from the provinces posed no physical threat. She was merely an informant. At 7 p.m., she returned to the Rue des Cordeliers for the third time. The sun was beginning to set. The heat in Paris was oppressive. She wore a spotted pink dress and a high hat decorated with a black cockade. She looked perfectly respectable, perfectly harmless. Simone Evrard again tried to block her path, raising her voice to tell the stranger to leave, but the noise carried down the hall. From his bathtub, Marat heard the commotion. He had read her first letter. He called out to Simone, instructing her to let the woman in. Simone stepped aside. Charlotte Corday walked down the narrow corridor and entered the small, steamy bathroom. The physical reality of the scene was grotesque. The room smelled of vinegar and sickness. Marat sat in the copper tub, a towel wrapped around his head to soak up sweat, his skin raw and blistered. A map of France hung on the wall. The wooden board across the tub was covered in ink, paper, and lists of names. Charlotte stood over him. For 15 minutes they engaged in a chilling transaction. Marat asked her for the names of the Girondin deputies who had fled to Caen. Charlotte, remaining perfectly calm, dictated the names of the men she actually admired. Marat wrote them down meticulously. When he finished, he allegedly looked up at her and said the words that sealed his fate. "Excellent. In a few days, I will have them all guillotined in Paris." That was the trigger, the absolute proof that he was irredeemable. Charlotte did not hesitate. She reached into her dress, drew the kitchen knife, and lunged downward. She drove the blade into the right side of his chest, just under the clavicle. The strike was extraordinarily violent and perfectly placed. It passed between the first and second ribs, punctured his right lung, and severed the aorta. Blood immediately violently sprayed the room, staining the water, the papers, and the floor. Marat screamed a single sentence: "Help me, my dear friend." He called out to Simone, but he was dead before she reached the room. The moment the blade severed Marat's aorta, the history of the French Revolution fractured. Time in the small, vinegar-scented bathroom on the Rue des Cordeliers seemed to stop and then violently accelerate. Charlotte Corday let the bone handle slip from her fingers. The knife clattered onto the wooden board, spanning the copper bathtub. She took a step back, making no sound and offering no resistance. She stood perfectly still, her eyes locked on the bath water as it turned a thick, opaque crimson. The silence lasted less than a second. Marat's dying cry, calling for his common-law wife Simone, shattered it. Simone Evrard tore into the room, followed immediately by Laurent Bas, a man who worked folding L'Ami du Peuple for distribution. Bas took one look at the blood, the dying Marat, and the calm woman standing over him. He grabbed a heavy wooden chair and swung it at Charlotte's head. The blow struck her, knocking her to the floor. As she struggled to rise, Bas threw himself on top of her, pinning her to the ground. Within minutes, the apartment was overrun. Neighbors, soldiers of the National Guard, and a local surgeon named Pelletan crowded into the claustrophobic space. Pelletan rushed to the bathtub. He tried to compress the wound, but the anatomical damage was catastrophic. The blade had passed cleanly between the first and second ribs, slicing downward through the right lung and opening the aorta. Marat was already dead. The man who had demanded the blood of 100,000 citizens had drowned in his own. While the medical staff pulled Marat's lifeless body from the water, and laid it on his bed. The political machinery of Paris kicked into gear. The police commissaire of the section, a man named Guillard, arrived to secure the scene. He found the assassin sitting quietly in the adjacent salon, surrounded by furious National Guardsmen with their bayonets drawn. She was disheveled from the blow to the head, but her breathing was remarkably even. Guillard began the preliminary interrogation immediately. He demanded her name, her age, and her origin. She answered without hesitation. She gave her full aristocratic name, her age of 24, and confirmed she was a resident of Caen. She did not attempt to obfuscate her identity or her motive. When Guillard asked who had incited her to commit this crime, her answer was a flat, cold rejection of their worldview. She stated she had incited herself. She formed the plan, bought the weapon, and executed the tyrant. Guillard ordered a search of her person. The guards patted her down. They found the sheath for the kitchen knife concealed beneath her dress. They found her birth certificate. They found a thimble, a ball of thread, and 18 francs. But the most explosive piece of evidence was a folded sheet of paper pinned to the inside of her bodice. It was a manifesto. She had titled it an address to the French who are friends of law and peace. Guillard unfolded it and read the exact parameters of her radicalization. Charlotte had not written a confession. She had written a declaration of war. The text was a blistering attack on the Jacobin faction. She accused the radical leaders of turning Paris into a slaughterhouse and stripping France of its dignity. She explicitly stated that she was sacrificing her own life to prevent a civil war and to show the nation that tyrants could be struck down. She concluded the document by stating she hoped her severed head would be carried through Paris to rally the true patriots. She had planned to die in that apartment. She had pinned the manifesto to her chest so that when the mob tore her apart, her ideology would be found among the wreckage. But the mob had not torn her apart. The guards were holding them back. News of the assassination had leaked into the streets of the Cordeliers district, a radical stronghold violently loyal to Marat. A massive howling crowd was gathering outside the building. They were armed with pikes, butcher knives, and muskets. They were screaming for the assassin to be thrown out the window so they could rip her limb from limb. Inside the apartment, the interrogation escalated. High-ranking members of the Committee of General Security began to arrive. Among them was François Chabot, a former Capuchin monk turned radical Jacobin revolutionary. Chabot was a man consumed by paranoia. He made his political career by uncovering complex, labyrinthine conspiracies against the state. Chabot looked at Charlotte Corday and saw an impossibility. To the Jacobin mindset of 1793, women were biologically and psychologically incapable of independent political action. They were considered creatures of emotion suited only for domestic obedience. If a woman committed a political crime, it was an absolute certainty that a man had manipulated her into doing it. Chabot and his colleagues hammered her with questions. Who was her lover? Which Girondin deputy from Caen had paid her? Who drew the map of Paris for her? Who told her what time Murray took his bath? Charlotte treated their questions with a mixture of polite contempt and stark defiance. She told them they were wasting their time. She insisted that no man had ordered her to strike. She mocked their assumption that a woman could not possess the intellectual capacity to recognize a tyrant and the physical resolve to eliminate him. She told Chabot that she possessed enough hatred in her demon heart to commit the act without borrowing it from anyone else. This psychological warfare infuriated the interrogators. Her calm demeanor insulted their grief. They expected a hysterical girl begging for mercy or a fanatic foaming at the mouth. Instead, they got a stoic, articulate philosopher who calmly explained that she had murdered their god as a matter of civic duty. Around midnight, the authorities realized they had a severe logistical problem. They needed to move Charlotte from Marat's apartment to the Abbaye prison to await formal trial. But the street outside was packed with thousands of furious citizens demanding immediate, brutal justice. The police feared the crowd would overpower the guards and lynch her. They brought a closed carriage to the front door. A massive cordon of National Guardsmen, standing shoulder to shoulder with fixed bayonets, formed a narrow corridor from the doorway to the carriage step. Charlotte was led out. The moment the crowd saw her, the noise became deafening. Men and women surged forward, trying to break the military line to tear at her dress or gouge her eyes. The guards pushed them back with the butts of their rifles. Charlotte did not flinch. She did not lower her eyes. She walked through the corridor of screaming, violent hatred with her head held high, maintaining a posture of absolute aristocratic serenity. She stepped into the carriage. The guards surrounded the vehicle, and the horses lurched forward, forcing their way through the suffocating mass of people. As the carriage rolled toward the Abbaye, the mob beat against the wooden sides and pressed their faces against the glass windows, screaming death threats. Charlotte sat in the dark interior, watching the distorted faces slide past the glass. She was entirely at peace. The hardest part was over. The tyrant was dead. Now all she had to do was navigate the machinery of the revolutionary tribunal and secure her place in history. But while she sat in the prison cell that night, resting for the first time in days, the Jacobin leadership was already rewriting the narrative. They were examining the bloody scene in the bathtub. They were looking at the letters she had used to trick her way inside. They were realizing that this murder was not just a security breach. It was a political goldmine. Charlotte Corday thought she had struck a fatal blow against the radical regime. She did not yet understand that she had just handed them the ultimate excuse to unleash the reign of terror. The sun rose over Paris on Sunday, July 14th, 1793, exactly 4 years to the day after the storming of the Bastille. But the city was not celebrating liberty. It was suffocating under a blanket of paranoid grief. The news of Jean-Paul Marat's assassination had bled outward from the Rue des Cordeliers, infecting every district, every political club, and every street corner. Inside the halls of power, the reaction of the Jacobin leadership was swift and entirely unsentimental. Men like Maximilien Robespierre and Louis-Antoine de Saint-Just did not mourn Marat the man. In life, Marat had been a volatile, uncontrollable liability. His constant screaming for blood often complicated the Jacobins' attempts to consolidate political power. But in death, Marat was perfect. He was a blank canvas onto which they could paint their ultimate justification for absolute, unchecked state violence. They immediately began the process of weaponizing his corpse. The convention ordered Jacques-Louis David, the premier painter of the revolution, and a radical Jacobin himself, to organize the funeral. David understood the assignment perfectly. He was not tasked with burying a politician. He was tasked with engineering a secular god. He went to Marat's apartment to view the body. He found a decaying, skin-diseased corpse with a gaping chest wound rapidly putrefying in the sweltering July heat. David ignored the physical reality. He saw only the political utility. He began sketching the layout for what would become his masterpiece, the death of Marat, consciously erasing the agonizing skin condition and replacing it with the smooth, pale flesh of a classical martyr. While David designed the myth, Charlotte Corday sat in a damp cell in the Abbaye prison, surrounded by guards. She was completely cut off from the outside world. She had no idea that she had just provided the radical regime with the exact psychological leverage they needed to crush their enemies. She spent her first full day in captivity writing. She asked her jailers for pen and paper, and surprisingly, they obliged. They wanted her to write. They hoped she would implicate the Girondin deputies who had fled to Caen. They wanted a list of co-conspirators. Instead, Charlotte wrote a long, detailed letter to Charles Barbaroux, one of the leading Girondins she had met in Normandy. The letter is a masterpiece of psychological detachment. It reads less like the confession of a murderer waiting to die and more like a dispatch from a victorious general. She detailed her journey to Paris, the deception she used to gain entry to Marat's apartment, and the assassination itself, which she described with clinical precision. She did not express a single ounce of remorse. She complained only about the noise of the mob outside her window and the rudeness of her interrogators. In her mind, she was living inside a Roman tragedy. She was Brutus. She was Judith. She signed the letter Juana Corday, citizen of France, and added a postscript quoting her great-grandfather, Pierre Corneille. "The crime makes the shame, not the scaffold." On Tuesday, July 16th, she was transferred from the Abbaye to the Conciergerie. This fortress, located on the Ile de la Cité, was known as the antechamber of death. Prisoners who entered the Conciergerie rarely left except in a wooden cart bound for the guillotine. The transfer signaled that her trial was imminent. She was placed in a tiny cell on the ground floor. 2G&D. Arms were stationed inside the cell with her at all times, ordered never to let her out of their sight. The Jacobins were terrified she might commit suicide. They needed her alive for the spectacle of the trial. They needed the public to see the monster destroyed. The trial began the very next morning, Wednesday, July 17th at 8 o'clock. The courtroom of the Revolutionary Tribunal was a theater designed for intimidation. It was packed with a hostile, sweating crowd. The air was thick with the smell of unwashed bodies and raw anger. When the guards brought Charlotte into the room, the noise level dropped. The crowd leaned forward, straining to see the bloodthirsty fanatic they had been promised. What they saw deeply unsettled them. Charlotte was dressed simply but elegantly. Her dark blonde hair was carefully combed. Her posture was rigidly straight. Her face was pale but completely serene. She looked like a young aristocrat attending a tedious social function, not an assassin facing the blade. The president of the tribunal, Jacques-Bernard-Marie Montané, presided. The chief prosecutor was Antoine Quentin Fouquier-Tinville, a man notorious for his ruthless efficiency in sending suspects to their deaths. He viewed the law merely as a mechanism for political cleansing. Fouquier-Tinville began the interrogation. He did not ask her if she killed Marat. The evidence was undeniable. He asked her to confirm the facts of her journey and her entry into the apartment. Charlotte answered in a clear, caring voice, confirming every detail. She corrected the prosecutor when he got minor facts wrong. She owned her actions completely. Then, Fouquier-Tinville shifted to the core of the Jacobin paranoia. He needed to prove a conspiracy. He asked who had ordered her to commit the murder. Charlotte looked directly at him and stated she had formulated the plan alone. Fouquier-Tinville sneered. He suggested she was lying to protect her lovers in Caen. He pressed her on her relation. IPS with the Girondin deputies. He asked who had given her the idea that Marat was a tyrant. Charlotte's patience snapped. She delivered a line that struck at the heart of the radical male ego. "I did not need the hatred of others," she told the court. "I had enough of my own." Montané, the judge, intervened. He tried a different tactic. He asked if she thought she had killed all the Marats in France. He was hinting at the hydra of the revolution. Cut off one head and another grows. Charlotte answered with chilling simplicity, "With this one dead, the others will perhaps be afraid." She was utterly relentless. She refused to play the role of the hysterical, manipulated woman. She claimed intellectual ownership of her violence. When Fouquier-Tinville held up the cheap bone-handled blade, still stained with dried blood, and asked if she recognized it, she barely glanced at it. "Yes," she said, "I recognize it." She was then asked the question that would define her legacy. Why? Why bypass the democratic process? Why commit murder? Charlotte stood taller. She spoke not just to the judges, but to the historical record. "I knew that he was perverting France. I have killed one man to save 100,000. The courtroom erupted. The logic was flawless to a classical scholar, but to the Jacobins, it was treason of the highest order. She was publicly declaring that their revolutionary idol was a monster, and she was doing it without a trace of fear. The tribunal had assigned her a defense attorney, Claude-François Chauveau-Lagarde. He was a brilliant lawyer who would later risk his own life to defend Marie Antoinette. But in this courtroom, on this day, he had nothing to work with. His client refused to apologize. She refused to claim insanity. She demanded to be judged for her actions. Chauveau-Lagarde stood up to speak. The room fell silent. He looked at Charlotte, then turned to the judges. He did not try to defend her crime. That would have been professional suicide and entirely useless. Instead, he delivered a masterclass in psychological defense. He told the court that the defendant had confessed to everything. She admitted the premeditation. She admitted the assassination. He stated that this total lack of remorse, this terrifying calm, could not be explained by ordinary logic. He argued that it was the result of political exaltation. She was a fanatic, he said, consumed by a false idol of patriotism. He asked the judges to weigh her fanaticism in their scales. It was the only defense possible. It preserved her dignity while acknowledging the reality of her impending death. Charlotte smiled at him when he sat down. She appreciated that he had not degraded her by begging for mercy. The jury deliberated for less than half an hour. The verdict was a foregone conclusion. She was found guilty of treason and premeditated murder. Judge Montané read the sentence, death by the guillotine. The execution was to be carried out that very evening. Furthermore, to cement her status as a traitor to the nation, she was ordered to wear the red chemise of a parricide to the scaffold. When asked if she had anything to say regarding the sentence, Charlotte simply shook her head. She asked for one final favor. She requested that a letter she had written to her father be delivered. In it, she asked for his forgiveness for disposing of her life without his permission, and she quoted Corday one last time. She was taken from the courtroom back to her cell in the conciergerie. It was early afternoon. She had less than 4 hours to live. While the executioner sharpened the blade at the Place de la Révolution, Charlotte received a visitor. It was not a priest. She had refused all religious comfort, stating she needed no intermediary between herself and God. The visitor was an artist named Jean-Jacques Hauer. During the trial, Charlotte had noticed Hauer sketching her from the gallery. She had turned her head to give him a better angle. Now she had requested that he be allowed into her cell to finish the portrait. The authorities, perhaps recognizing the propaganda value of capturing the assassin's final moments, agreed. For the next 2 hours, the woman who had just violently altered the course of European history sat quietly in a stone cell, critiquing her own portrait. She asked Howard to make minor adjustments to the mouth and the eyes. She wanted the final image of Charlotte Corday to be perfect. She wanted the future to see a rational, calm patriot, not a bloody fanatic. At 4:30 in the afternoon, the heavy iron door of the cell swung open. Charles-Henri Sanson, the chief executioner of Paris, stepped inside. He carried a pair of heavy shears and a length of rough rope. The final ritual had begun. Charlotte stood up. She thanked Howard for his work, took the scissors from him, and cut off a lock of her own hair, handing it to the artist as a token of gratitude. Then she turned to Sanson. The executioner was a professional who had dispatched hundreds of people, including the King of France. He expected resistance, weeping, or collapse. Charlotte offered none. She took off her white cap. She sat on a wooden stool and allowed Sanson to cut her long, blonde hair close to the neck, ensuring the heavy blade of the guillotine would not be impeded. Then came the red chemise. The coarse, heavy woolen shirt was slipped over her dress. It was designed to humiliate, to mark her as a monster who had slain the father of the revolution. But on Charlotte, the red fabric simply looked like a severe tragic costume. Sanson pulled her arms behind her back and bound her wrists tightly with the rope. For the first time, a flicker of physical discomfort crossed her face. She asked if he could tie them a little looser, as the ropes were cutting into her skin. Sanson, perhaps moved by her stoicism, loosened the knot slightly. "You have a long journey ahead of you," he allegedly murmured. "We will have time enough to rest. I'll..." "At her," she replied. She was led out of the conciergerie and into the glaring late afternoon sun. The tumbrel, a crude wooden cart pulled by a single horse, was waiting in the courtyard. The journey to the Place de la Révolution would take over an hour. The streets of Paris were lined with tens of thousands of citizens, waiting to see the woman who had killed Marat. Charlotte Corday stepped up into the cart. She stood perfectly straight in her red shirt, the jagged ends of her shorn hair framing her pale face. The gates of the courtyard opened, the driver cracked his whip, and the cart rolled out into the roaring ocean of the Parisian mob. The tumbrel was not a vehicle designed for dignity. It was a crude, unsprung wooden cart, typically used for hauling manure or firewood, now repurposed to transport the condemned to the Place de la Révolution. It offered no seating. As the heavy wooden wheels struck the uneven cobblestones of the Rue Saint-Honoré, the cart jolted violently. Most prisoners, bound at the wrists, were forced to lean against the rough wooden slats to avoid falling over, their faces pale, their bodies shaking with terror. Charlotte Corday refused to lean. She stood dead center in the cart. Her feet were planted firmly on the splintered floorboards. Her hands were bound tightly behind her back, the rough rope cutting into her wrists, but she kept her spine entirely rigid. The heavy woolen fabric of the red chemise, the garment of the parricide, absorbed the oppressive July heat. As the cart cleared the gates of the conciergerie and crossed the Pont Neuf, the summer sky finally broke. A sudden violent thunderstorm erupted over Paris. Heavy, driving rain lashed down on the city, turning the streets into slick, muddy rivers. The rain soaked through the red chemise, plastering the heavy fabric to her skin and outlining her frame. It plastered her newly shorn, jagged hair against her skull. The storm should have been a miserable final humiliation. Instead, it heightened the terrifying theatricality of her final hour. The water washed the dust of the prison from her face, leaving her skin pale and gleaming in the strange bruised light of the storm. The route to the guillotine was deliberately long. It was designed as a public spectacle, a mobile pillory, where the citizens of Paris could hurl abuse, rotten vegetables, and political hatred at the enemies of the state. Tens of thousands of people lined the route. The sans-culottes, the radicalized working class who had worshipped Marat, packed the narrow streets. They hung from windows. They climbed onto rooftops. They brought their children to see the monster who had murdered their champion. They expected to see a terrified girl or a raving, fanatical demon. They expected someone they could easily dehumanize. Instead, they were confronted with absolute, chilling serenity. Journalists and diarists stationed along the route recorded a bizarre psychological phenomenon. As the cart approached, the crowd would roar with customary fury. They screamed for her blood. But as the cart drew level with them, and they actually looked into her face, the screaming frequently died in their throats. Her composure was weaponized. She looked down at the furious, screaming mob with an expression of mild, detached pity. Rather than sneering or averting her gaze, she observed them as if they were a tragic, misguided force of nature, entirely separate from her own moral certainty. A prominent Jacobin journalist, Jacques-René Hébert, a man even more radical and bloodthirsty than Marat, watched her pass. He later wrote in his newspaper Le Père Duchesne, attempting to mock her, but his words inadvertently revealed his own deep unease. He noted that she stood with the audacity of a demon, refusing to show a single physical sign of weakness. The executioner, Charles-Henri Sanson, rode in the cart with her. Sanson was the ultimate authority on the choreography of death in Paris. He had executed the king. He would eventually execute the Queen, Danton, and Robespierre. He had seen hundreds of men, hardened soldiers, aristocrats, and politicians, weep, vomit, and collapse on this final journey. Sanson kept a diary. In it, he recorded his genuine astonishment at the 24-year-old woman standing beside him. He noted that she did not flinch when the crowd hurled death threats. She did not pale when the storm broke. At one point, as the cart jolted particularly hard, she lost her balance slightly. Sanson reached out to steady her. She thanked him politely, as if he had held a door open for her at a salon, rather than securing her footing on the way to her decapitation. After an hour, the cart finally entered the Place de la Révolution. The vast open square was packed with an ocean of humanity. In the center stood a massive, imposing statue of Liberty, ironically erected on the pedestal where the statue of King Louis XV had once stood. And nearby, elevated on a wooden scaffold, painted a dull, practical red to mask the bloodstains, stood the guillotine. The cart backed up to the wooden steps of the scaffold. The rain had slowed to a drizzle. The sky remained dark and heavy. Sanson offered his arm to help her down. She accepted. She climbed the steep wooden steps with a firm, even tread. When she reached the platform, the sheer scale of the machine and the massive crowd stretching out to the horizon became visible. Sanson, operating out of a twisted sense of professional courtesy, immediately moved to stand in front of her, trying to block her view of the guillotine's mechanics. He knew that the sight of the blood-stained bascule, the wooden plank, and the gleaming, heavy-angled blade suspended high above often broke the final reserves of a prisoner's courage. Charlotte stepped to the side to see around him. Sanson gently told her there was no need to look. She replied with perfect calm, stating she had the right to be curious, as she had never seen one before. He examined the machine not with terror, but with the clinical interest of someone inspecting an abstract mechanical device. The assistants moved in. The execution had to be fast. The protocol was designed for industrial efficiency. They did not give her time to address the crowd. They took her by the arms and pushed her forward against the vertical wooden plank. She did not resist. The plank tipped forward on its hinges, sliding her horizontally into position. The wooden lunette, the upper half of the collar, slammed down over the back of her neck, locking her head in place above the leather basket. She was looking down into the dark, blood-soaked leather. Sanson reached for the release lever. He pulled it. The heavy lead weight drove the angled blade down the greased wooden grooves. The impact was deafening. A massive wet crunch of steel severing spine, muscle, and flesh. Her head fell into the basket. Her blood jetted from the severed arteries, spraying into the sawdust pit below. It was 7 p.m. The assassin was dead. But the spectacle was not over. The psychological war between Charlotte Corday and the Jacobin state continued immediately, centered entirely on her severed head. One of Sanson's assistants, a carpenter named Legros, who'd been hired to help with the heavy lifting around the scaffold, reached into the leather basket. He grabbed Charlotte's head by her short, jagged hair. He lifted it high into the air and walked to the edge of the platform to display it to the mob, a standard practice meant to confirm the death of an enemy of the state. But Legros was not satisfied with the display. Infuriated by the aristocratic arrogance she had shown in the cart, and consumed by the radical hatred of the moment, he pulled his arm back and delivered a vicious, open-handed slap across her severed cheek. The sound echoed across the square. The reaction was instantaneous, and it was not what Legros expected. The massive, bloodthirsty crowd, a crowd that had cheered up as she was strapped to the plank, emitted a collective, audible gasp of horror. Even in the darkest days of the Reign of Terror, there were unspoken rules regarding the dignity of the dead. The execution was the state's justice. Mutilating or insulting a corpse after the law had been satisfied was viewed as barbaric, a regression to the lawless butchery of the September massacres that the revolutionary government was desperately trying to distance itself from. Then came the visual anomaly that would cement her legend. According to multiple eyewitness accounts published in the days following the execution, the moment Legros slapped the cheek, Charlotte Corday's face flushed. A deep, undeniable red blush of indignation spread across both her cheeks. Her eyes supposedly flicked toward the assistant executioner with an expression of unmistakable anger. Scientifically, modern medicine tells us that the brain rapidly loses consciousness upon decapitation due to the catastrophic drop in blood pressure. The blush was almost certainly a physiological reaction. Blood pooling in the capillaries of the face due to the physical force of the slap, combined with post-mortem muscle spasms that could simulate a facial expression. But science did not matter in 1793. The myth mattered. The story of the blushing head spread through Paris by nightfall. It ignited a furious medical and philosophical debate that would last for years. Prominent anatomists like Samuel Thomas von Sommering and Jean-Joseph Sue would later write extensive treatises arguing that consciousness, and therefore the ability to feel pain and register insult, persisted in a severed head for several minutes after decapitation. Politically, the slap was a disaster for the Jacobins. It made them look like savages attacking a defenseless noble victim. The government recognized the public relations catastrophe immediately. They ordered Legros arrested. the assistant executioner was thrown into the Abbaye prison for 13 months for breach of revolutionary etiquette. The state had to punish its own executioner to maintain the illusion that the guillotine was a civilized instrument of justice, not a tool of butchery. But the Jacobins had a much larger problem than a disgraced carpenter. They had to control the narrative of who Charlotte Corday actually was. They could not accept that a young provincial woman had outsmarted their security apparatus, assassinated their most prominent leader, and faced death with the stoicism of a Roman gladiator, entirely of her own volition. It contradicted the fundamental tenets of their worldview. In the Jacobin ideology, a woman who engaged in political violence was not a patriot. She was an unnatural aberration, a hysterical puppet manipulated by male counter-revolutionaries. They needed proof to destroy her character. They needed to prove she was morally and sexually corrupt. The standard narrative to discredit female political enemies was to frame them as prostitutes, mistresses, or sexually deviant manipulators. They assumed with absolute certainty that she must have had a male lover, likely one of the Girondin deputies in Caen, who had ordered her to commit the murder and rewarded her with his bed. To find this proof, the Committee of General Security ordered a post-mortem physical examination of her corpse. Her headless body was transported from the Place de la Révolution to the Necker Hospital. A team of prominent revolutionary doctors, led by the surgeon Jacques-Louis Houssard, was ordered to perform an autopsy. Their primary directive was to examine her reproductive organs. They were looking for evidence of a recent pregnancy, signs of syphilis, or a ruptured hymen. They were ordered to medically classify her as a sexually active, corrupted woman. The doctors conducted the examination in the dim light of the hospital morgue. They filed their official report to the committee. The report was a political bombshell. It contained a single, devastating medical conclusion. Charlotte Corday was a Virgo intacta. She was a virgin. The physical examination completely shattered the Jacobin narrative. They could not smear her as a manipulative courtesan. They could not blame a phantom lover. The medical reality forced the radical leadership to confront a terrifying intellectual truth. She had acted alone. She had read the same Enlightenment texts they had read. She had analyzed the political landscape. She had identified the tyrant. And she had executed a flawless surgical strike against the state, driven by nothing but her own pristine, uncompromising intellect and a terrifyingly pure ideology. In failing to biologically discredit her, the Jacobins inadvertently validated her manifesto. They confirmed that she was exactly what she claimed to be, a solitary, ideological assassin. With the smear campaign ruined, the Jacobins pivoted entirely to their second strategy. If they could not destroy the assassin, they had to deify the victim. Jean-Paul Marat's funeral was scheduled. Jacques-Louis David, acting as the ultimate stage manager of the revolution, turned the event into a massive pagan spectacle. Marat's body was embalmed, poorly, as the heat in his skin condition accelerated the decay, and placed on a raised monumental bed in the nave of the former church of the Cordeliers. David arranged the lighting to cast dramatic shadows, hiding the rotting flesh and highlighting the wound. The murder weapon, the cheap bone-handled kitchen knife, was displayed on a velvet cushion like a holy relic beside him. The wooden board he used as a desk, still stained with his blood, was suspended above the corpse. For days, a relentless procession of Parisians filed past the body. The atmosphere was one of mass hysteria. Women lifted their infants to look at the corpse. Political clubs marched in formation, swearing oaths of vengeance over the rotting flesh. Orators stood on platforms, declaring that Marat was not a man, but a God of liberty, and comparing him explicitly to Jesus Christ. O heart of Jesus, O heart of Marat, one prominent Jacobin orator screamed to the weeping crowd, "You have the same right to our homage." The cult of Marat was born. Busts of his face replaced crucifixes in churches across Paris. Streets were renamed in his honor. The city of Le Havre changed its name to Havre Marat. Charlotte Corday had aimed her knife at the heart of the terror, believing she was cutting out the cancer. But the knife did not kill the disease. It merely lanced the boil, spreading the infection into the bloodstream of the nation. She gave the radical faction the one thing they lacked to achieve absolute power, an unassailable dead martyr. A living Marat could be argued with, discredited, or outmaneuvered. A dead Marat was an abstract concept of victimhood that demanded infinite blood to balance the scales. The trap she had inadvertently built was now fully armed and operational. The Committee of Public Safety, led by Maximilien Robespierre, looked at the weeping, furious crowds worshipping at Marat's bathtub, and they saw an unlimited mandate. The assassin had proven that the Republic was surrounded by invisible enemies, capable of striking anywhere, even in the most private sanctuaries. The only logical response was to preemptively destroy anyone who could possibly harbor such thoughts. The blade that severed Charlotte Corday's neck did not conclude the violence. It merely organized it. Before her intervention, the radical Jacobins relied on the chaotic, unpredictable fury of the Parisian mob to intimidate their enemies. Marat had been the conductor of that mob, whipping them into frenzies that resulted in erratic bloodbaths like the September massacres. But Charlotte's assassination of Marat inadvertently gifted the Jacobins something far more lethal than a mob. She gave them an absolute mandate to build a bureaucracy of death. The guillotine, which had previously been used select, Avely was rapidly prepared for industrial operation. Charlotte Corday's head had fallen, but the true harvest of her beautiful mistake was only just beginning. In September 1793, less than 2 months after she went to the scaffold, the National Convention passed the law of suspects. It was the complete legal architecture of the Reign of Terror, and its justification was built entirely on the paranoia her lone wolf act had crystallized. The law did not target those who had committed crimes against the Republic. It targeted those who might. It authorized the arrest of anyone who, by their conduct, their associations, their remarks, or their writings, showed themselves to be partisans of tyranny or federalism and enemies of liberty. It was a blank check for state-sponsored murder. Guilt was no longer a matter of evidence. It was a matter of state intuition, and the first demographic to be fed into this new industrialized machinery were the very people Charlotte Corday had sacrificed her life to save. Charlotte had worshipped the Girondins. She viewed them as the true intellectual heirs of the Enlightenment, men of law, debate, and constitutional order. When they were purged from the convention in June 1793, she believed her assassination of Marat would paralyze the Jacobins and allow the Girondins to return to power. Her calculation was tragically inverted. To the Jacobin leadership, led by Maximilien Robespierre, the knife in Marat's chest was irrefutable proof that the Girondins were not just political rivals, but active, violent conspirators plotting to murder the leaders of the Republic. Charlotte's lone wolf action was framed as the opening salvo of a massive Federalist terror campaign. On October the 24th, 1793, 21 prominent Girondin deputies, the men Charlotte had spoken to in Caen, the men whose names she had deceptively dictated to Marat in his bathtub, were brought before the Revolutionary Tribunal. It was a show trial. The chief prosecutor, Fouquier-Tinville, did not bother to construct a coherent legal argument. He simply pointed to the dead martyr in the Pantheon and the royalist uprisings in the provinces. When the trial dragged on for a week, threatening to expose the lack of actual evidence, the convention simply passed a decree allowing the jury to cut deliberations short if their consciences were sufficiently enlightened. Their consciences were enlightened the very next day. All 21 men were condemned to death. On October 31st, the Girondins were loaded into the tumbrils. They were the brightest, most eloquent men of the early revolution, the architects of the Republic. As they rode to the Place de la Révolution, they sang the Marseillaise, maintaining their republican dignity to the very end. The guillotine worked with mechanical efficiency. It took 36 minutes to behead all 21 of them. The last to die, Charles-Éléonore Dufriche de Valazé, had already stabbed himself in the courtroom the day before, but the state insisted on decapitating his corpse alongside his living colleagues. Charlotte Corday had set out to be their savior. She ended up serving as their executioner's primary excuse, but the devastating collateral damage of her kitchen knife did not stop with the Girondins. The most profound and lasting consequence of her act fell upon the women of France. Prior to July 1793, the French Revolution had been a period of unprecedented, albeit volatile, political awakening for women. Working-class women had led the March on Versailles in 1789 to bring the king back to Paris. Women formed powerful political clubs, most notably the Society of Revolutionary Republican Women. They debated legislation, demanded price controls on food, and agitated for the right to bear arms in defense of the Republic. The Jacobins had initially tolerated and sometimes encouraged this female militancy when it served to intimidate their moderate rivals. Charlotte Corday destroyed that fragile tolerance overnight. When the autopsy proved she was a virgin, operating purely on her own intellectual and ideological fanaticism, the Jacobin patriarchy was terrified. If a quiet, educated girl from a convent could calmly butcher the most feared man in Paris, then any woman in the galleries, in the streets, or in their own homes could be a threat. Female political agency was no longer viewed as a revolutionary asset. It was diagnosed as a lethal, unpredictable pathology. The state moved swiftly to neutralize the female demographic. The justification was explicitly tied to Corday's legacy. In late October 1793, Jean-Baptiste Amar, a prominent member of the Committee of General Security, stood before the convention to deliver a definitive decree on the status of women in the Republic. His speech was a masterpiece of institutional misogyny, weaponizing the trauma of Marat's death. Amar argued that women lack the physical and moral strength necessary to debate laws and resist oppression. He claimed that their natural biological disposition made them prone to dangerous emotional extremes that led directly to acts of treason and assassination. He did not need to say Charlotte Corday's name. Her ghost was standing right beside him at the podium. The convention voted immediately. All women's political clubs and popular societies were banned outright. Women were forbidden from meeting in groups of more than 5 in the streets. They were barred from attending the debates of the convention unless accompanied by a man. In a matter of hours, half the population of France was legislated out of the public sphere and ordered back into the domestic shadows. To enforce this new reality, the Revolutionary Tribunal turned its attention to the most prominent female figures of the era, regardless of their political affiliation. The state needed to make spectacular examples of women who had stepped out of their natural boundaries. The first was the ultimate symbol of the old regime, Marie Antoinette. The former queen had been imprisoned in the Temple and later the Conciergerie for over a year. She was politically neutralized, a grieving widow suffering from severe hemorrhaging and failing eyesight. But the Jacobins needed a female monster to contrast with their male martyr. Her trial in mid-October 1793 was a grotesque degradation. Fouquier-Tinville accused her of orchestrating orgies, depleting the national treasury, and, in a final act of psychological torture, incest with her 8-year-old son. She was convicted of high treason. On October 16th, dressed in a plain white shift, her hair violently hacked off, she was driven to the guillotine in an open cart. Like Corday, she maintained an iron composure, refusing to give the screaming mob the satisfaction of her tears. But Marie Antoinette was an obvious target. The more chilling execution occurred 2 weeks later, proving that the terror was now devouring its own ideological sisters. Olympe de Gouges was a brilliant playwright, abolitionist, and one of the earliest, most vocal feminist philosophers in history. In 1791, she had written the Declaration of the Rights of Woman and of the Female Citizen, a direct challenge to the male-centric constitution, arguing that if women had the right to mount the scaffold, they must also have the right to mount the speaker's rostrum. She was a dedicated Republican, but she was also a moderate who detested the bloodlust of the Jacobins and had publicly criticized the execution of the king. Following the assassination of Marat, her outspokenness became fatal. The Jacobins could not tolerate a female intellectual criticizing their methods. She was arrested and brought before the tribunal in November 1793. Her trial was brief and her conviction guaranteed. Before she was taken to the guillotine, the prosecutor publicly condemned her not just for her political views, but for her gender transgression. She was executed, the state proclaimed, because she had forgotten the virtues that belonged to her sex and had attempted to be a statesman. The message was broadcast to every corner of France. Female participation in the political destiny of the nation was a capital offense. By the winter of 1793, the psychological atmosphere of Paris had mutated into a state of permanent, suffocating terror. The romantic philosophical revolution that Charlotte Corday had read about in the convent library at Caen was entirely dead. In its place was a paranoid, highly efficient bureaucratic slaughterhouse. The guillotine was moved from the Place de la Révolution to the Barrière du Trône to accommodate the sheer volume of executions and to keep the stench of blood away from the center of the city. The executioner, Sanson, optimized his workflow, decapitating victims in batches of 30, 40, or 50 a day. The streets ran with literal blood, requiring the installation of special drainage systems beneath the scaffold. Citizens stopped speaking to their neighbors. Families turned on each other. A misplaced word, a lack of enthusiasm at a revolutionary festival, or simply addressing someone as monsieur instead of citizen was enough to warrant a midnight knock on the door, a brief appearance before Fouquier-Tinville, and a ride in the tumbril. And ruling over this empire of paranoia was the omnipresent ghost of Marat. His painted portraits and plaster likenesses glared down from the podiums of the convention, serving as silent executioners. His name was invoked to justify every purge, every execution, and every suspension of human rights. Charlotte Corday had intended to cut the head off the snake. She failed to realize that in the ecosystem of radical revolution, if you kill the loudest monster, the system simply breeds a colder, quieter, and infinitely more efficient one to take his place. She had bought a kitchen knife to save 100,000 lives. She had instead given the architects of the terror the exact psychological leverage they needed to build the abattoir. The machinery of the reign of terror accelerated by a single knife thrust in a Parisian bathroom, operated with flawless mechanical brutality for exactly 1 year. But a government structured entirely around paranoia and mass execution operates on a mathematical deficit. You eventually run out of enemies. When you run out of aristocrats, you execute the moderates. When the moderates are dead, you execute the radicals who are not radical enough. Finally, you execute each other. In July 1794, almost exactly 12 months after Charlotte Corday mounted the scaffold, the Jacobin apparatus consumed itself. Maximilien Robespierre, the architect of the terror who had brilliantly leveraged Marat's assassination to seize absolute power, stood before the National Convention and threatened a new, unnamed list of traitors within the government itself. It was a fatal miscalculation. The deputies, realizing that anyone could be on that list, struck first. In a frantic, violent coup known as the Thermidorian reaction, Robespierre and his inner circle were declared outlaws. They were arrested, their jaws shattered by pistol fire during the capture, and dragged to the exact same guillotine where they had sent tens of thousands of others. The radical phase of the French Revolution died with Robespierre. The cult of Marat was dismantled almost overnight. His busts were smashed in the streets. His body was eventually removed from its place of honor in the Pantheon. The Jacobin clubs were forcibly closed, and a reactionary conservative government took control, eventually paving the way for the military dictatorship of Napoleon Bonaparte. Charlotte Corday had won. Her primary objective, the destruction of the radical Jacobin faction, was achieved. But her victory came on a delayed timeline. Her act inadvertently provided the Jacobins with the exact catalyst they needed to execute 40,000 citizens, fracture the Republic, and subjugate French women. It remains one of the most Pyrrhic victories in modern political history. As the blood dried and the 19th century began, the historical memory of Charlotte Corday underwent a radical calculated distortion. The conservative and romantic writers of the post-revolutionary era did not know what to do with her. They hated the Jacobins, so they logically needed to celebrate the woman who killed their chief propagandist. But 19th century European society was deeply patriarchal. They could not celebrate a woman for possessing a cold, calculating, and ruthless political intellect. They could not admit that a 24-year-old girl had out-strategized the state security apparatus. So they rewrote her psychology. They stripped away her agency and replaced it with sentimentality. The poet and historian Alphonse de Lamartine gave her the title that would permanently cement this distortion. He called her l'ange de l'assassinat, the angel of assassination. It was a brilliant piece of historical whitewashing. By labeling her an angel, Lamartine removed her humanity. Angels do not read political philosophy. They act on divine intervention. Angels do not plan tactical murders. They execute the will of heaven. by framing her as a supernatural, emotional creature driven by a tragic, melancholic love for her country, the male historians of the 19th century safely neutralized the terrifying precedent she set. They turned a radical, ideological assassin into a tragic heroine suitable for romantic paintings and stage plays. Her image was relentlessly reproduced. Artists painted her in her prison cell, looking soft, tearful, and regretful. Three things she explicitly never was. They painted her standing over Marat with a look of horror, ignoring the documented fact that she stood over his bleeding corpse with absolute serene satisfaction. They focused on her blushing cheek on the scaffold, turning a physiological spasm into a symbol of violated feminine modesty. The historical Charlie Corday, the stoic intellectual who mocked her interrogators, who told the revolutionary tribunal she had enough hatred in her own heart to commit murder, and who demanded to be judged as an active combatant, was buried beneath a mountain of Victorian melodrama. Yet, despite this systematic sanitization, her legacy as a woman who shaped the revolution remains uniquely uncontainable. When we examine the landscape of female figures in the French Revolution, they largely fall into two categories defined by male action. There are the passive victims, like Marie Antoinette, who were crushed by the machinery of the state. And there are the intellectual victims, like Olympe de Gouges or Madame Roland, who tried to influence the system through writing and diplomacy, only to be executed when their words became inconvenient. Charlotte Corday belongs to neither category. She is the only prominent woman of the era who took direct offensive physical action against the highest echelon of the government. She bypassed the pamphlets. She bypassed the political clubs. She identified the center of gravity of the radical faction, purchased a weapon, and eliminated it. She proved that the ultimate glass ceiling of political power, the monopoly on lethal violence, could be shattered by a woman acting entirely alone. This is the terrifying core of her historical relevance. She is the prototype for the modern ideological lone wolf assassin. Long before the anarchists of the late 19th century, before Gavrilo Princip plunged Europe into World War I, Charlotte Corday demonstrated the asymmetric power of the individual fanatic. She showed that you do not need an army, a vast conspiracy, or immense wealth to alter the destiny of a nation. You only need an unshakable belief that you are right, a willingness to die, and a 5-inch kitchen knife. But she also stands as the ultimate historical warning against that exact philosophy. Her assumption was rooted in a fatal misunderstanding of how political terror operates. She believed tyranny was a disease localized in a single man. She thought Marat was the engine of the radical revolution. She failed to understand that Marat was merely the exhaust pipe. The engine was the collective trauma, poverty, paranoia, and rage of the Parisian working class. Marat did not create the anger. He just provided the vocabulary for it. When you assassinate a man who speaks for a traumatized populace, you do not silence the populace. You validate their deepest fears. You prove to them that the elite, the aristocrats, the others are actually trying to destroy them. By killing Marat, Charlotte Corday did not extinguish the fire. She poured gasoline directly onto it. She gave the radical faction the unassailable moral high ground of victimhood. The Jacobins used her act to build a totalitarian state that she could not have possibly imagined in her convent library in Caen. Today, the physical artifacts of her act are scattered. The original Jacques-Louis David painting of Marat hangs in Brussels, a masterpiece of propaganda that still successfully manipulates viewers into seeing a bloodthirsty agitator as a peaceful saint. Marat's bathtub, the copper shoe-shaped vessel where the Republic was fundamentally altered, was sold, exhibited in a sideshow, and eventually purchased by a private collector. The skull of Charlotte Corday, or what is widely believed to be her skull, was separated from her body, passed down through generations of the Bonaparte family, and remains in a private collection, a morbid souvenir of a woman who tried to use her mind to save the world, only to lose her head. The story of the angel of assassination is not a story of heroism. It is a story of catastrophic miscalculation. It is a brilliant, terrifying case study of what happens when abstract idealism collides with the brutal mechanics of fanaticism. She sought to shape the revolution, and she did. She shaped it into a nightmare. The blood in the bath to be at 30. Rue des Cordeliers was scrubbed away centuries ago. The building itself is gone, swallowed by the modernization of Paris. But the psychological stain of that July evening remains permanent. Charlotte Corday took the highest ideals of the Enlightenment, reason, duty, and patriotism, and sharpened them into a weapon. She stepped out of the domestic sphere to which women were confined, bypassed the men who were paralyzing the nation with debate, and executed a decisive, lethal solution. In doing so, she became the eternal mirror of the revolution itself, beautiful in theory, ruthless in execution, and utterly disastrous in outcome. She reminds us that the line between a patriot and a fanatic is drawn entirely by the consequences of their violence. She killed one man to save 100,000, and in doing so, she condemned them all. The knife is still falling.